Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to the Warren County Historical Society's Lunch and Learn for April. Our speaker today is Harriet Merriman. She, a former educator, taught for over 30 years at Plain City and other places in Ohio. She lives in Westerville. She has been for a number of years now active in the Ohio Historical Society, now called the Ohio History Connection. Performing and working with their programs and their public programs over there. In the past, she has co-written the Freedom Trail about the Underground Railroad in Westerville as part of the Westerville Park and Recreational Department, the Westerville Historical Society, and the Westerville Public Library. She's also performed as a lady from Franklinton, which is just west of downtown Columbus, of the 1913 flood. Over here we often refer to as the Dayton flood, but the entire part of Ohio was flooded. And she has also done performances as Florence Allen, the first female member of the Ohio Supreme Court, and Dayton's Irma Bombeck. Life's a bowl of cherries, so why am I in the pits? And this summer, she will be at the Echoes in Time Theater of the Ohio History Center as Harriet Taylor Upton about women's suffrage and fighting for the vote, and that'll be in June. Today, she's going to be Jerrie Mock. Now, Jerrie Mock was an aviator who flew a plane called the Spirit of Columbus. Now, she should be as well known as the pilot of the Spirit of St. Louis. But the difference is about 45 years. And so things changed and people weren't paying attention to things like that, but it does not make her story less interesting. Perhaps it may even add to it. Ladies and gentlemen, Jerrie Mock.
In 1956, there was a very popular movie being shown called Around the World in 80 Days. Well, 8 years later, I embarked on my own trip around the world, but instead of traveling in a balloon, I flew an airplane, and it took me 29.5 days. I am often asked, Jerrie, what prompted you to want to fly around the world? Well, for the answer to that, I have to go back to my childhood when I was 7 years old. My father took me on a short plane ride, and from that moment on, I was hooked. I am going to be a pilot, I declared. Well, a few years later, as I listened to the radio broadcasts about a very famous other aviation woman, Amelia Earhart, I decided that I, too, wanted to see the world, the oceans, the jungles, the deserts, the people. After graduating from Newark High School, I enrolled in the Aeronautical Engineering program at Ohio State, the only female in the class. But then a young fellow caught my eye, and I dropped out of college and married Russell Mock. We settled in Bexley and started our family. Well, my husband got his pilot's license, so I decided I would take lessons while my 2 boys were in school, and I got my pilot's license in 1958. We became half owners of an 11-year-old 4-seat Cessna 180. In 1960, our daughter was born, and I continued to be a stay-at-home housewife and mother. Well, one night at the dinner table, I complained to my husband that I was bored staying at home all day. I wanted to go somewhere. Well, he jokingly said, well, you should get in our plane and fly around the world. All right, I will. My long-ago dream was going to become a reality. About 3 months before my departure, an official from the National Aeronautic Association called with a tip. Since Earhart, no woman had seriously considered flying around the world. He went on to say that another woman named Joan Merriam Smith was going to attempt it at the same time I was. My dream trip was turning into a race. I scrambled to get the plane ready for departure. So for 2 weeks, we set about, and we were afraid that if we didn't get going, the Columbus Dispatch would cancel the $10,000 pledge that they made for exclusive rights to the story, and I would be sent back, and which would in effect cancel our trip. But first, we had to prepare the plane. My small single-engine airplane with the federal registration number N1538C in bright red letters down the side of the fuselage was bathed in floodlights at the Wichita, Kansas Municipal Airport on the evening of March 17, 1964. The plane was being modified for the venture I was about to undertake. Its doors were propped open as men twisted and bent and heaved to secure mounting brackets that held 2 huge fuel cells in place within the cabin, taking the place of the passenger seats. A federal inspector moved in, checked every tank mount, every fuel line connection. He nodded, papers were signed, and he left. Now I had to travel 800 miles back to my home, Columbus, Ohio, for the starting point of the flight that would make me the first woman to fly around the world. The morning of March 19th, I was getting ready for takeoff from Port Columbus. A crowd had gathered and I was bombarded with questions. Is it true your airplane is 11 years old? Jerry, could you get out of the plane and pose with the governor? You sure don't look like a pilot in that blue knit outfit and high heels. Are you going to change before you take off? Instructions were given. Rags, clean rags, Jerry. You must wrap clean rags around the filler hole when the tanks are fueled. This will keep the fuel from slopping into the cabin. Well, I finally was guided away from the reporters. What they didn't realize was how nervous they made me feel, and the prospect of flying a single-engine airplane over the ocean wasn't nearly as frightening as crowds of people. Well, good news awaited me in the terminal building. The weather looked just fine all the way from Columbus to Bermuda, my first stop. I was in the flight service station, and above the constant noise in the room, I said, I'd like to file an international flight plan. I wrote down that I would fly at 7,500 feet for approximately 7 hours. I hurried back to my Cessna, and I got last-minute instructions from my husband. Now remember, Jerry, you promised you phone the Columbus Dispatch the minute you land at every place. Remember, they have exclusive rights, so don't talk to those other reporters very much. He strapped the heavy yellow plastic life jacket around me, and I crawled into Charlie, my pet name for the spirit of Columbus, and with a parting kiss. The door was slammed shut, and I called out, "Clear, Columbus ground. This is Cessna 1538 Charlie in front of lanes. Taxi instructions for takeoff." 38 Charlie is cleared for takeoff. Straight out approved. Roger, 38 Charlie. Then it struck me. If I pushed in that throttle, what would I really be doing? Beginning? What was ahead beyond the airport? oceans, jungles, deserts, mountains, but what else? I knew I had to find out. Gently, I eased in the throttle, and Charlie and I raced down the runway and leaped into the air, eager to explore the world. Always, we must travel east until we come back home to Columbus, almost 24,000 miles ahead. Columbus to Bermuda, 1,141.63 statute miles, flight time 6 hours 38 minutes. Flying over Virginia, I knew that I would soon be inside of the ocean. I needed to get my long-range radio working, so I turned it on and switched to the proper channel for New York Oceanic Radio. Then flipped the switch to the electric motor that reeled in and out the 100-foot-long antenna, a wire that trailed underneath the plane. I watched the meter. The needle didn't move. What was wrong? Well, carefully, I went over the procedure again. Still nothing. Now what should I do? Go home? No, I couldn't let those people down who believed in me. Soon I would be over the last radio beacon on American soil. I decided to tune in to Norfolk on the VHF radio. Contact was made, but faded quickly. Here I was, in my gasoline-laden, flying electronic boxcar, cut off from the world. There was no living soul, no sound except the monotonous but comforting drone of the engine. Maybe the sensation of the unreal was strong that day because it was my first real flight over the ocean. I was flying in the mysterious Bermuda Triangle, where so many ships and planes had disappeared without explanation or any trace of debris. Cut off from radio communication, it was easy to imagine that the spirit of Columbus might be destined to join the list of strange disappearances. I told myself, relax. I tuned in to my two automatic direction finders and tuned them to the Bermuda station. I was delighted when I picked up a weak signal. But wait a minute, the needles of the two finders were pointing 60 degrees apart. Which one was giving me the true bearing to the station? Then I remembered. One of the antennas had been relocated while in Wichita. The number 1 ADF had not been disturbed, so as far as I knew, I decided to trust it. But then clouds seemed to close in. Now, Charlie and I didn't dare get caught in the clouds without clearance. The only way to finish the flight clear of the clouds was to go beneath them. As the plane started down, the needle spun around crazily. Then, when I finally was heading east again, the needles showed Bermuda behind me. I turned the plane around in that direction, and finally, there in front of me was Bermuda. It had been hidden by the clouds that I tried to avoid. I hurriedly tuned in to Kinley Air Force Base on the radio and gave them my position. They asked if I would like a surveillance radar approach. Affirmative, Kinley. I didn't tell them it was the first one I'd tried by myself. Well, I touched down on the runway and the plane stopped in a few hundred feet. Whew. That was over. I had made my first overseas landing. Then I looked around. I was about 2 miles from the terminal building. I got the plane to the turnoff point, but then the wind slammed into the big tail and kept trying to turn the Cessna around back to the wind. I had to hold the brakes to keep the plane under control, but I soon realized that the brakes were hot and weren't holding. So with all my strength, I literally stood on the pedal while 4 airport attendants came out to help guide my plane and get it parked. Well, a crowd of photographers and reporters were waiting as I got out of the plane, when suddenly a gust of wind came around the corner and hurtled the plane towards a stone wall. I screamed. Everybody ran. Well, we rescued the Spirit of Columbus within a foot of having its cowl and wings bent into a useless, twisted pile of aluminum. Well, that was my first day. I wondered what was going to await me the next day. After I got a night's rest, I checked in with Kinley for the weather forecast. Bad weather. A front was moving in. Well, that meant a delay. However, I could get my radio fixed. After 7 long days, the weather conditions were improving over the Atlantic and the radio was fixed. It was time to take off. Bermuda to the Azores. 2,254.62 statute miles, flight time 13 hours, 4 minutes. Except for a few clouds in the way below, the sky was clear. And the sky was clear, and soon after the sun went down, the stars came out, beautiful and bright. Was this really real? I actually pinched my arm to see if I was awake. Then I noticed that the plane was slowing up. But why? And I was losing altitude. Something was wrong. Then a frightening thought. Ice. I turned my flashlight beam on the outside door. Ice about an inch thick clung to the strut. I radioed Santa Maria in the Azores and asked to climb higher. I waited and waited and waited. Finally, I got clearance and Charlie climbed. After some time, the sky began to lighten, the sun's rays came out, and it was warm and the ice melted. After landing and resting, I took a tour of the island. I felt I was stepping back into the past. The people, their clothes, their tools, their houses, all belonged in a history book. The next morning, there was an icy wind, but the cloud layer was a little higher. Things were looking good. Santa Maria, Azores to Casablanca. 1,015 statute miles, flight time 5 hours, 34 minutes. A little over 24 hours after landing at Santa Maria, Charlie and I took off in the biting cold wind. A few hours later, the friendly clouds below the plane began to grow higher. I could no longer stay on top, so I had to let the autopilot guide me. Well, Charlie bounced around. It was a funny feeling, sitting there with nothing to look at but the red nose of Charlie. It felt creepy, like something was going to happen. And it did. Ice again. I radioed Casablanca and asked to climb higher. And I waited. Finally, I received the go-ahead, and soon I was in the sun and the ice melted. Below me, I saw Casablanca. As I landed Charlie, a crowd was there to welcome me. I spent a wonderful evening in Casablanca, but the next morning, I was again disappointed when the weather kept me grounded. Casablanca to Beaune, 902 statute miles, flight time 6 hours. The weather the following morning didn't sound much better. The original plan was to fly to Tunis, but because of the weather, it was suggested that I fly to Bonn, Algeria. After getting papers signed, Charlie and I were once again in the air, and I made my landing at the airport in Bonn. Well, sleep came quickly, and the next morning, I went to the airport to check the weather and to file my flight plan to Cairo. Well, the weather was just fine, they told me. Even the sandstorms along the way, they were nothing to worry about. The air traffic controller told me to mark down Tripoli as my intended place of landing. No, I said, I want to go to Cairo. Finally, to end the arguing, I agreed to put down Tripoli. Then he told me that as I approached Tripoli, tell them I wasn't landing but proceeding to Cairo. Just as I was about to take off, I was startled by a rapping on the door beside me. "You can't go to Cairo, bad sandstorm." Okay, I'll land in Tripoli. Bonn to Tripoli. 418.13 statute miles, flight time 2 hours 39 minutes. I settled down to watch the scenery as I flew over the Sahara Desert. Suddenly, my reverie was broken. I smelled something burning, the odor becoming stronger by the minute. My mind raced. The motor to the high-frequency radio. I had forgotten to turn it off in time, and the motor had been grinding away. It was just inches from the big tank, the one filled with high-octane aviation gas. The plane could have blown up at any second. Well, panic set in. But my mind said, settle down. I got my mind to work again. And reason told me that the only thing to do was to sit quietly and let the scorching metal cool. Well, what seemed like hours, the smell of burning wire and insulation went away. The spirit of Columbus churned along as smoothly as ever. The British-sounding controller landed me safely, but to my surprise, he wasn't expecting me. Bonn had never transmitted my flight plan. Tripoli to Cairo. 1,091.21 statute miles, flight time 7 hours 11 minutes. Now, Cairo is about 7 flying hours from Tripoli, and I wanted to get there before dark. So I got up at 4:30 a.m. and after a harrowing ride to the airport and getting all the paperwork finished, I climbed in Charlie and pushed the starter button. Nothing happened. Well, I found the mechanic and he decided it was the starter solenoid. That happened to be the only spare part that I had brought with me. But to find it. Now, try and picture this. I figured it was in one of the bags hanging behind the main cabin tank. Well, I pulled at the bags and they jammed and refused to budge. There was about 6 or 7 inches between the top of the tank and the cabin roof. I began wiggling my way on top of the tank. I realized that the bags were wedged in by an oil can, and try as I might, that can would not move. Meanwhile, the desert sun was baking the metal skin of the airplane, turning it into an oven. Sweat gushed from every pore. It was hopeless. I just plain cried. Well, finally, I got a grip on myself, crawled out, got a tool, and went back to the top of that tank. And with a few blows, the can fell free, and I retrieved the bags, and After emptying all of them, the starter was in the bottom of the last bag. Well, the part was installed and I was on my way. As I approached Cairo, the radio tower instructed me to runway 5. Cairo Tower 38 Charlie is on downwind for runway 5. The tower told me to continue the approach. The wheels gently touched the runway as the voice of the controller said, 38 Charlie, what is your present position? 38 Charlie's on the ground. Even as I answered, I knew something was terribly wrong. Well, I saw a taxiway and I turned onto it. And at the same time, 3 trucks full of soldiers careened around the corner from another taxiway, raced towards me, and slammed to a stop within inches of Charlie, blocking my way. Guns in hand, the soldiers surrounded my plane. Well, I shut the engine down and I opened the door. Right away, in very good English, the soldier said, "Madam, you are not in Cairo." My response was, well, okay, where am I? Well, he refused to answer, but instructed me to turn the plane around and follow him. The procession of trucks, soldiers, and plane made its way back down the runway until we reached a building where I was told to park. The phone was ringing as we entered the building. Cairo was looking for me. There followed an hour of non-stop talking, and I was the cause of it all. Well, it soon became clear that they were faced with a big problem. What to do with me? Well, the soldiers were interested in seeing this lady pilot, and they were very nice to me. From them, I learned that I had landed at a secret Air Force base. Finally, the commander came out and said that I could go. But then it was dark. Oh, I assured them, though, that I could fly in the dark. Charlie was positioned for takeoff, and I received instructions on how to get to the Cairo airport. Now, madam, you take off down the runway. It's the wrong runway, but you're going to use it anyway. When you get into the air about 1,000 feet, you will see lights to an airport on your left. Don't land. Military. On your right, you will see lights to another airport. Land. That's Cairo. Well, there was a crowd of people waiting for me at the Cairo airport, but the next few hours were a blur. After a good night's rest, I was ready to continue my journey. Cairo to Dhahran. 1,173.37 statute miles, flight time 8 hours, 14 minutes. My international flight plan was accepted, but getting gas in Charlie was another matter. As they tried to fill the tank, gas spurted from the nozzle and started running all over my clothes and charts, dripping down the sides and onto the floor. "Stop!" I heard myself yelling. I jumped on the plane and started tossing everything in the way of the gas onto the ground. Rags. I need clean rags. Well, I ended up using handkerchiefs to soak up the gas, wringing them out and reusing them. I even stuffed Kleenex around the nozzle. Well, I remembered the instruction that I had been given before taking off. Jerry, use clean rags. Well, you know, sometimes you gotta do what you have to do. The fumes were bad, but the tanks were finally filled, and I put things back in Charlie and was in the air again. Charlie and I took a cut across the southern part of Jordan into Saudi Arabia. I followed the black pipeline and Charlie purred smoothly across the desert. About an hour after I started following the pipeline, I realized that things didn't look the same. Nothing did. The ground below me seemed to be moving. Well, I wiped my sunglasses. Everything still looked fuzzy. I put on my oxygen mask. That didn't help either. Slowly, I began to realize I had flown into one of the sandstorms that I had been warned about. I thought back to what I had been told about sandstorms, and the only advice I could remember was to stay out of them. After many anxious moments, the swirling sand settled down, and I approached the Durand airport. White-robed men were crowded on the steps of the terminal to see the first flying housewife to venture into this part of the world. A handsome guard that Prince Faisal had sent to look after Charlie and me looked in the cabin of my plane, and his head started nodding. He shouted to the men, "There is no man." That brought a rousing ovation. Durand to Karachi. 1,063.33 statute miles, flight time 7 hours 38 minutes. After a restful night, I found Charlie all gassed and ready to go. I was greeted at the Karachi airport by John and Adelaide Tinker from the U.S. Embassy. She too was a flying housewife. I spent an enjoyable evening at their home, but the next morning it was time to move on. Karachi to Delhi. 665.54 statute miles, flight time 4 hours 36 minutes. April 5th was a beautiful cloudless day made for a pleasant flight to Delhi. The Aero Club members met me and had everything arranged from hotels to transportation to receptions and sightseeing. It was a new experience to be the talk of the town. As I settled in for the night, I decided India was a nice, friendly place, a good place to perhaps be weathered in for a few days. But it wasn't to be. Delta to Calcutta. 817.37 statute miles, flight time 5 hours 32 minutes. The flight from Delhi to Calcutta was short and easy. Once again, I was met by the Aero Club of India and others. With Charlie safely put away for the night, they said it was time for tea. Tea when it's 100 degrees outside? I tried to pass on it, but it had all been arranged. Fortunately, it was held in an air-conditioned room and turned out to be quite delightful. Calcutta to Bangkok. 999.56 statute miles, flight time 7 hours 32 minutes. Oh, I was having a wonderful sleep when it was suddenly shattered by a loud banging on my door. It was 3:30 a.m., the time I had asked to be awakened. As my driver and I left town on our way to the airport, that is when I witnessed the misery that extreme overpopulation causes. After seeing all the showy places in India, I now had a glimpse of those who spend their days in hopeless poverty, the very bottom rung of the caste system. Well, the flight to Bangkok seemed lonely and uneventful. I landed and had Charlie refueled. After a delightful dinner, I got back to the hotel, only to find that the air conditioner didn't work well and it was stifling. So I slept fitfully, and once again, a rap came on my door at 3:30 a.m. This time I was lucky and glad it was at 3:30. Bangkok to Manila. 1,365.79 statute miles, flight time 12 hours 19 minutes. Now, I had planned 2 different routes to take to Manila, but hadn't decided which one to take. Well, when I got to the airport, I was told that it was possible to go directly to Manila by a different route. Well, that was good news, so I checked the weather and found that it looked like a fine day. Now, Charlie had been gassed the day before, and I had allowed for what I thought was an adequate amount of gas. But with my new route, I wondered if it would be enough. Should I get more? Well, a man came running toward the plane wanting to make sure that I had the weather report. And since I didn't want to be held up anymore, I pointed to the top of the terminal, indicating where I had gotten the information. And with that, Charlie and I took off. So much for getting more gas. Well, things were going along peacefully when I gradually became aware that Charlie's engine didn't sound quite right. It was running rough. Something was wrong. The middle of the South China Sea was no place for an emergency landing. Instinctively, I pulled on the carburetor heat and the engine smoothed out. But when I pushed the knob back in, immediately the engine got rough again. Dirt. Suddenly, I remembered the stories I had heard about the things desert sandstorms do to engines. Well, I tried to relax because I thought I knew what the problem was. But now a new worry, the fuel. I knew I must pump every drop of gas out of the cabin tanks into the right wing tank. I remembered that to get every drop of gas out of the cabin tanks, I must turn on both transfer pumps at the same time and let them run until the engine stopped. That meant I was pumping air, and it was interrupting the steady flow of fuel to the engine. As soon as I turned off the pumps, the engine would start again. I kept my fingers on the switch. I'm glad no one could see how scared I was. There it was. The engine shuddered. I flicked the switch off. The engine settled back to a steady drone. Now I had to do it to the other tank. I started to drain the tank, then came the cough. Charlie hesitated. His nose momentarily dipped. He seemed surprised. I had the sensation of standing still in air. I turned the pump off, and the engine resumed its rhythmic throbbing. When that task was done, I was completely exhausted. Well, I tried to convince myself that everything was all right. I didn't like to admit it, but I was nervous. It was dark, and I felt terribly alone. All the radios were silent, and I said a prayer, in fact, lots of prayers. Then I heard it, a faint signal from Lubang, then Manila. A big crowd of people was at the Manila airport to greet me when I landed. Questions came from all directions. I was told that the inspection of Charlie would take place the next morning. Well, I slept well, and when I arrived at the airport the next morning to make certain that Charlie was taken care of, I was told that the necessary parts were in the custom house and it was closed for a holiday. So I did have a day to explore Manila. The next morning, I returned to the airport and found the mechanics busily working on Charlie. After a mistake with the hose connections, and they were corrected, Charlie was filled with gas, and I loaded my things back on the plane, ready for the next morning. Manila to Guam. 1,597.70 statute miles, flight time 11 hours, 39 minutes. I was cleared for takeoff, and with the engine sounding so good, I felt no fear, only excitement. I was heading home. Land and its population were left behind, and I was the lone adventurer, reveling in the glory of the ocean sky. The sun went down, and Charlie purred steadily on. Eventually, I eased Charlie on the runway at Guam. As my foot touched the ground, an excited voice from the crowd said, "Welcome back to the United States." Well, I was 6,000 miles from America, but I was on U.S. ground and surrounded by people from home. For 9 hours, 25 minutes, while on the ground in Guam, I went to a party, had a nice dinner with the governor, was on a TV program, slept about 4 hours, had coffee, and took care of the aircraft necessities. Guam to Wake, 1,501.33 statute miles, flight time 12 hours, 35 minutes. After landing in the dark and taking off before sunup, I had seen very little of Guam. I so much wanted to stay for a few days. But as I approached the airport at Wake, the sky ahead of me suddenly exploded in white fire. What on earth was happening? Well, I was able to guide Charlie down, and after being greeted by several hundred people, I learned that the flashes of light were flares that had been sent up to guide me. The next day, I learned that a cold front was between Wake and Hawaii, my next stop. It was suggested that I wait until 10:30 in the evening so I would hit the bad weather at dawn and could see to fly around the thunderstorms. I was a little nervous about taking off in a crosswind after dark, but finally it was time to go. Wake to Honolulu. It's over there. 2,345 statute miles, flight time 15 hours, 46 minutes. I guess the flight was what most pilots would call routine. But to me, it was exciting. I was alone. The night had closed in. Then came the dawn. I felt like a queen, monarch of all that I surveyed, my subjects, the foamy clouds and glowing rainbows. After 30 hours of no sleep, I was worried that I might goof on my landing, but all went well. After photos and interviews were completed, I was taken to a quiet hotel. I was so tired I slept in, so no sightseeing in Hawaii. Honolulu to Oakland, there. 2,409.60 statute miles, flight time 17 hours, 38 minutes. It was a little after 5 p.m. when I taxied Charlie out to runway 08 to begin the longest leg of my flight, Honolulu to Oakland. Now, before I left home, I had been somewhat apprehensive about flying all night. I was afraid I might fall asleep. Well, I found that oxygen helped me stay alert, so for at least once an hour, I put the oxygen mask on for about 10 to 15 minutes. My first sight of land was an island 38 nautical miles from Oakland. At this point, I didn't feel tired. I felt just wonderful, almost home. I landed, shut down the engine, and was greeted by a large crowd. But the person that my eyes found in the crowd was my husband, Russ. He pushed his way through the crowd and kissed me in front of the cameras. In fact, he kissed me several times so everybody could get photos. How romantic. Well, after more pictures, interviews, and a quiet dinner, I was worn out. The next day, it was good to get Charlie back in the air. I was anxious to get home. Oakland to Tucson, right over there. 746.62 statute miles. Flight time, 5 hours, 36 minutes. Once I cleared the Oakland control zone, I was free to fly wherever I wanted. I didn't tell anyone my plans, as I wanted to avoid another big crowd. I decided to land at Tucson as another day had ended and I was ready to stop. As I taxied in, a gas truck drove up, followed by a reporter. Oh well, one reporter was better than 10 or 20. After a quiet dinner, I went to bed. This was my last night away from home. Tucson to El Paso. 267 statute miles, flight time 1 hour 38 minutes. Tucson to El Paso was a short flight, and I realized it was the only day I'd prepared for a stop between morning and night. As I stepped from Charlie, I was engulfed by a mob of people and found that they had planned a civic celebration in my honor. I was presented with a key to the city, posed for pictures, and answered questions. But I was anxious to get in the air. I checked the weather report, as I had been told earlier that a front was moving in across my path. If I didn't take off immediately, I might get grounded. So Charlie and I took off and headed towards Columbus, Ohio. But did I have enough gas? I decided, I probably did, but how embarrassing if I ran out of gas a few miles out of town and had to land in a cornfield. Well, not wanting to end my flight around the world on an embarrassing note, I chose Bowling Green, Kentucky for a stop. El Paso to Bowling Green, 1,884.72 statute miles. Flight time, 6 hours, 52 minutes. When I landed in Bowling Green and went inside to freshen up, I received a call from Russ. How'd he know I was here? Well, Russ said, Jerry, do you realize that the whole FAA and the U.S. Air Force have been looking for you? When do you expect to arrive in Columbus? Well, I estimated that I would be there in about 2 hours. And with that, Charlie and I were once again in the air. Bowling Green, Kentucky to Columbus, Ohio, 286.08 statute miles. Flight time, 1 hour, 39 minutes. I turned my radio down as I crossed into Ohio. I was getting tired, and I wanted a last few minutes alone with Charlie. After spending so many solitary hours in my airplane home, I had come to think of this little Cessna as something more than an engineering design translated into nuts and bolts and airfoils. It almost seemed alive, a real friend. Charlie had seemed to enjoy the oceans and desert almost as much as I, except when he got sand in his carburetor. I patted the top of his tan instrument panel, and I thanked him for taking such good care of me. And I thanked God for flying along with me. Then I got back to the job of finding Columbus. I contacted Columbus Approach, and they told me to make a low pass down runway 9 so that they could clock me past it. The powerful engine screamed at the people as we flashed by. Then I entered the landing pattern for runway 23. Charlie rolled to a stop. We were on the ground. We had done it. Then I noticed the crowd. People all over the place, jumping up and down and waving banners. There were thousands of them. Russ and my sons, Roger and Gary, pushed through the crowd, and I got a hug and a kiss from each of them. Oh, wait a minute, where's Valerie? I want to see her. Russ held up our daughter so I could put my arms around her. She wasn't quite 4 years old and looked frightened and bewildered by all the people, so I held on to her tight. I was led to a platform where friends and family waited. I was presented with a gold pendant necklace, a globe that had ruby mounted in the position of every place I'd landed, and a diamond for Columbus. I was asked to give a little speech. I was completely flustered by then and really in a state of mental collapse. I remember saying something about the flight being pretty easy, but I wish that my autopilot could help me with speeches. But I do remember saying, you know, it's all been so wonderful. I do hope that somewhere, here and there, just my doing something that hadn't been done will encourage someone else who wants to do something very much and hasn't quite had the heart to try it. After all those months, it was over. By midnight on April 17th, 1964, inside a huge hangar, a small single-engine airplane, federal registration number N1538C, in bright red letters down the sides of the fuselage, stood alone. It had flown over 23,000 miles in 29.5 days. It had flown into the pages of history. My mind drifted back to the morning of March 19th when a reporter asked, "Jerrie, what made you decide to fly around the world?" Yes, what indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerrie, and a special Harriet. Would you like to answer some questions?
Well, I wanted to tell you first of all that thanks go to Jerrie for writing this book, 3-8 Charlie. Much of what you heard today were her exact words taken from her book. There are 2 bronze statues that commemorate Jerrie's accomplishment. One is at the Works in Newark, Ohio, dedicated in September 2013, and the other is at John Glenn International Airport, or the old Port Columbus, dedicated April 17, 2014. The Spirit of Columbus, or Charlie, is on permanent display at the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. Between 1965 and 69, Jerrie set more than 20 records for speed and distance. She received many awards. Among them, she received the Federal Aviation Agency Gold Medal for Exceptional Service presented by President Lyndon Johnson over there at the White House. Jerrie was inducted into the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame in 1979. She was inducted into the Women in Aviation Pioneer Hall of Fame in 2008. She was inducted into the City of Columbus Hall of Fame in October 13, 2014. And the Columbus Foundation established the Spirit of Columbus Award, and Jerrie received the first one. The award is lovingly called Jerrie's and is a heavy bronze replica of the sculpture of Jerrie and it's given every year now to individuals who have done outstanding things in the community. Jerrie eventually settled in Quincy, Florida, near her son Roger, and she died in her Florida home on September 30th, 2014, at the age of 88. Her wish was to be cremated, her ashes tossed into the Gulf of Mexico, so that she could once again make a journey around the world.
Well, thank you very much. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this. Please join us next month. We'll be talking about another aviator in flight, another record setter, and that would be Neil Armstrong. Please enjoy your trip through the museum, and don't forget to check out our gift shop. Have a good day now.